What are the heaviest sounding amps out there that you can find? Stay tuned, because I'm going to tell you. Yeah, I noticed here lately that some of my more popular videos, older videos, have been gaining some traction here lately. I'm not sure what the cause of that is, but I'm grateful. One video in particular was a video that I did about a year and a half ago called, on the greatest clean sounding amps ever. So I decided that as popular as that video has been lately, that I would go the other direction in this video and talk about the heaviest sounding amps ever. Now, before we get into it, first of all, I would like to invite you Facebook users out there to join the new Guitar Dungeon Face group. That's the name of the group. It's called the Guitar Dungeon, facilitated by this channel. However, it is not solely about this channel. It is about you, the community around it, and any guitar-related posts or ideas or questions or topics that you may have and would like to discuss. So please feel free to come join us on Facebook, and let's all hang out together. Also, for those that may have had an interest in supporting this channel via a one-time donation, I have now added a PayPal link down in the description of this video and all future videos. Please feel free to utilize that. Trust me, running a Guitar Gear channel by yourself ain't cheap. So, now that we got those house cleaning items out of the way, here are the 12 heaviest sounding guitar amps ever. Number 12, the Rivera Knucklehead. Mick Thompson's Slipknot has used the Knuckleheads quite extensively throughout Slipknot's career. Those earlier Slipknot albums in particular are absolutely crushing. And I know that they're a big band with a lot of instruments, and you got Jim Root and his guitar rig going on in there as well. But there's just something that's, something about Mick Thompson and, his rig and, the guitars that he plays, the way that he plays them, and, really just his entire persona that just seems to be that much more aggressive, aggressive from a metal standpoint. Back in my store days, we actually bought in a prototype that was a Rivera Knucklehead that was designed specifically for Mick Thompson himself. I believe it was literally one of one. This particular customer had the contacts and the money, and he was able to get a hold of it. We bought it from him, and I got to play that thing a few times before we sold it, and it was a killer amplifier. Number 11, the VHT/Fryette Pittbulls. Without getting into the whole history of VHT and Fryette amplifiers, the short of it is they used to be called VHT. They sold the VHT name and logo to somebody else, so that's why VHT amps are still around, but they're completely different from the big giant 100-watt heads that a lot of old school fans know and love. Anyway, so they sold the name and the brand to somebody else, and in a sense, kept their old models and everything and just changed the name of the company to Fryette. So the Fryette Pittbull and the VHT Pittbull, along with the Deliverance and several other their amp models, are all the same. For the longest time, the VHT Pittbull was my blood amp because one of the greatest, fattest, heaviest sounding guitar tones I have ever heard was Mick Mars's guitar tone on the self-titled Motley Crue album from the mid-90s. The one when Vince Neil had left the band for a brief period and they got John Corabi to come in and sing vocals. That one that the band, for some weird reason, does not really like to acknowledge much in their, throughout their history. After that album was made, they toured behind it, and when that was over and Corabi left and Vince Neil came back, they never played any of those other live songs again. I've never even heard any of them, really barely discuss it. Regardless, that's one of the greatest guitar tones I've ever heard. That album was one of my all-time favorite albums. And Mick Mars was actually using VHTs on that record. I can't confirm if it was Pittbulls or not, but I know he was at least using VHT power amps among other things. And that's what attracted me to the Pittbull. And I've gotten to play one or two over the course of my life, and that's an amp that I would still really, really like to have. Number 10, Bogner Uberschall. I have to admit, well, I guess I like the Uberschall as much as anybody else does. Bogner make great amplifiers. The Uberschall's no exception. There's nothing wrong with the Bogner Uberschall whatsoever. It's not one of my favorites. However, Alice in Chains guitar player Jerry Cantrell is one of my all-time favorite guitar players, and he played Bogner Uberschalls for a large portion of his career, and he got some of the heaviest sounding tones on that amp that I've ever heard, particularly on the Black Gives Way to Blue album. Bogner have since released an Uberschall distortion pedal version of this, which I believe is actually now discontinued, but you can still find them out there on the used market. That's actually a pretty close recreation of the gain channel of the Uberschall itself. So if you don't have the money for an Uberschall, you might pick up one of those pedals on the used market and get awfully close. Number 9, Mesa Boogie dual rectifier and triple rectifier, because those are really the exact same amp. The only difference between them is 50 watts. Regardless, admittedly, I'm not much of a dual rectifier, triple rectifier kind of guy. However, if I were going to name an amplifier that defined the sound of a decade in the 2000s, there's no question it would be the Mesa Boogie dual rectifier. Mesa Boogies in general are typically pretty dark sounding amplifiers, but that works in their favor because they got a ton of gain on them. They've got really tight low end on them. They can, even with the gain cranked up, they can stay really articulate. There are so many artists out there and so many records that have been recorded with the dual rectifier in all of its generations, because it's been around for a long time now. Admittedly, another one that's not necessarily my favorite on this list, but they do have their place, and they certainly have their place on this list. And by the way, the video that I did recently on IK Multimedia's Amplitude plugin software does have a dual rectifier amp in that software plugin, and I did demo a short portion of it, and it sounded pretty good. Number 8, Soldano SLO-100. This amp actually started life back in the late 80s. Mike Soldano earned his reputation by hot rodding old Marshalls, and that's pretty much where that's what the SLO stands for. It stands for Super Lead Overdrive, which is essentially a hot rodded Marshall, but a very hot rodded Marshall. And what a lot of people don't seem to know is that the SLO-100. After the tone in Eddie's Marshalls had begun to deteriorate just due to age and a lot of use over the years, this was the amp that Eddie Van Halen used to record Van Halen's For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge record. This was also the amp that inspired Peavey to work with him to design what we now know as the 5150 series. The original 5150 series. These are one of the pricier amps on this list. These things, the heads alone, run around $4,000 a piece. They're really expensive. And I have also heard recently that Mike Soldano has decided to finally retire. I don't know. I have not heard anything what is going to become of the Soldano company, if he's going to sell it and somebody else is going to keep running it, if he's shutting it down, I don't know. If he does shut it down, these amps are going to skyrocket in value, because you can't buy them new anymore. Regardless, SLO-100 is a legendary amplifier. Number 7, Ampeg SVT Classic. Yes, this is a bass amp. I'm aware of that. However, I have found not very many guitar players have had the opportunity to plug a Les Paul into an SVT Classic head, going into an SVT Classic 810 cabinet, and crank it. You crank up the gain, yes, and you crank everything on that amplifier, and yes, it is insanely loud, but it's a really cool high gain, vintagey type of high gain tone that you've probably never heard. It's very unique. I encourage everybody to try that at some point in their life if they haven't already. It's not the kind of modern high gain that you would expect out of a lot of amplifiers that are out today. It's a totally different vintage type of heavy feel to it. But I can see like a lot of the vintage fanatics and the Doom players that would really enjoy an experience like that. So yeah, Ampeg SVT Classic for guitar. Badass. Number 6. Marshall JVM 210H. When the Marshall JVM series come up in a conversation, everybody seems to automatically go to the 410, the 4-channel version. Certainly a great amplifier. However, each one of those channels actually has, I think, 3 different modes, and each mode has a couple of different, I found 2 channels is plenty and covers all the ground that you could possibly need to cover. The JVM, I like the 2-channel version myself because, as I mentioned, it's plenty. Covers all the different types of Marshall sounds over their entire history for the most part. But when you get to the red mode on the gain channel and crank everything all the way up, it's brutal. It is absolutely brutal, and that's why it's popular among a lot of modern day metal guitar players today, such as Jason Hook from Five Finger Death Punch, one of my favorite modern metal bands. Number 5. Krank Rev 1 Plus. Krank amplifiers have had a bit of a tumultuous history. Of course, they, when they first started, Dimebag Darrell was their first big name endorser, of which they came out with the Krankenstein, the Dimebag Darrell signature head, and actually the first tube amp that he was ever known to use. Certainly the first one that he ever endorsed. The Krankenstein, and I've played a few of them, and it seems to be kind of temperamental. You bump a knob, just a hair too far one direction, and you can wind up in a different county if you're not careful. The Rev 1 Plus, on the other hand, seems to be a little bit more forgiving, but what the Rev 1 Plus does really, really well is really, really tight, high gain. It'll rattle your bones. The only way that I can think to accurately describe the sound of the Rev 1 Plus is thunderous. Number 4, Diamond Amps Nitrox. Speaking of Five Finger Death Punch, Five Finger Death Punch guitar player Zoltan Bathory seems to favor the Diamond Nitrox amplifiers, as he has been using them for over a decade now, I believe. And, he seems to like them for the same reason that I seem to like them. It's a really tight-sounding, high-gain, modern high-gain sounding amp. You can have the gain turned all the way up, you can have the bass turned all the way up, and the bottom end will not flub out. It still remains tight the whole way through. It's just a killer sounding amplifier, and compared to a lot of other high gain amplifiers like that, they're really not all that expensive. That's another plus to them. Whether you love Five Finger Death Punch like I do, or you hate them, go listen to their War Is the Answer album and just listen to the guitar tone. The guitar tone throughout that entire record is absolutely killer. Number 3, the Crate GXT 100. What? Number 3. The real number 3. Marshall JCM 800. In my opinion, no other amplifier out there defined an era and a genre the way that the JCM 800 defined metal throughout the 80s. Every single metal band in the 80s played and used a JCM 800, be it on stage or in the studio or anywhere in between at some point throughout their career. If you were playing guitar in the 1980s, it was JCM 800 or bust. That's the amp that everybody had to have. Now, by today's standards, compared to some of these other modern sounding amplifiers that I've already mentioned on this list, as well as several other amps out there, you're right, it's not nearly as heavy sounding. However, back in the era of the 80s, that type of gain hadn't come out yet. JCM 800 was as heavy as it got. That's the amp that everybody had to have, and that is why it has become such a classic and is still used by so many different guitar players on so many records even today. The vintage models are becoming very highly sought after, especially ones that have not been modified and all hacked up, which are getting harder and harder to find. Marshall has since reissued the JCM 800, and it is still made today. An absolute classic of an amplifier. I would love to have a JCM 800. Number 2, Orange Thunderverb 200. Now, in the Orange lineup, the Rock Reverb seems to be the most popular amp among the metal players. However, I have found, especially now that the Thunderverb is discontinued, and I'm talking about the high-end British-made models, not the import combos that are the TH combos that are still made today, but the original Thunderverb series that came out of the UK. A lot of people have not had the opportunity to play to play through one of those amplifiers. Those amps came with a built-in attenuator on them. So you could crank it all the way up and then use the attenuator to back off on the volume so that you could get the full sounding amp, the full sound of the amp cranked all the way up without blasting out everybody else's ears or pissing off the sound guy. Orange amps, the Thunderverb being no exception, have a really, really dark sound to them, but what I like about the Thunderverb the most is the gain structure to it. A Thunderverb 200 with the gain cranked all the way up, running through an orange PPC 412 cabinet, is one of for the longest time, it was the heaviest guitar tone that I had ever heard. Until, number 1, Diezel Herbert. Until I had the chance to play through a Diezel Herbert. I didn't know that much gain existed. And more importantly, I didn't know that you could play through that much gain and still not get muddy. If you're a metal player and you're a fan of high gain metal amps, the Diezel Herbert is a must-have. I had the chance to play it through 2 Diezel 412 cabinets a couple of times back in my store days, and I'm still blown away with just how heavy sounding that amplifier is. It's a favorite of my all-time guitar player, James Hetfield of Metallica. He still uses the Herberts in his guitar rigs today, among other amps, but the Herbert is one of the main bases of his current guitar tone. And there's just and that's not the only thing that amp will do. It does a lot of other things, but the gain sound coming through that amp is the most bone-shaking, gut-punching, thunder-rattling sound for guitar sound that I have ever heard in my life. Probably the most expensive amplifier on this list. The head alone right now retails for $41.99. And if you want a 412 cabinet on top of that, add another $1,400 or $1,500 depending on where you go. So if you want a Diezel Herbert, they're pricey. You're going to pay for it, especially if you buy them new. They seem to hold their value pretty well in the used market too. Because they're so expensive, they just don't sell that often, so there's not too many of them out there. And the people that did spend the big money on them generally don't get in a real big hurry to let them go. Diezel's got several legendary amps out there. Of course, the argument could be made for the VH4, but I love the Herbert. That's always been my favorite Diezel amp for the reasons that I have just described. I would love to have a Diezel Herbert. If I owned a Diezel Herbert, that may very well be the last amp I ever bought from metal. So there we have it. There is our list of the greatest heavy-sounding amps ever. Yes, I'm aware that this list is very, very subjective, and by subjective, I mean my own opinion, specifically my favorites, but it's my list, and I can call it whatever I want. I know that there's also a lot of other great sounding heavy amps out there that I did not include on this list. Feel free to share your thoughts on your favorites, especially if especially if it was one that I did not include. Leave it down in the comments down below. I'll post links to all the amps that I discussed in the description as always. Check out the other links in the description as they are pertinent. They may be pertinent to this video. And last but not least, if you haven't subscribed to this channel already, please consider doing so. I would love to have you. It really helps out a lot. Thank you so much for watching. Adios.